Like, I mean, this is not ideal. I'm also just a bit cognizant of people going to be popping in and out, trying to get their own breakout rooms and dropping messages in the chat, which I think could be detrimental to the debate. Which I just want to...
So the reasoning is we can only stream when the call is happening in the main room. We've enabled waiting rooms, so no one is going to be joining the call sporadically throughout.
Yeah, okay. Or yeah, and maybe just try and move people who are not here, or maybe like are not explicitly flagged as observers out of this way. I just don't want to impede the debaters any more than they have already been impeded. So in the spirit of getting moving as quickly as possible, my name is Omar, he, they pronouns. Panel, if you would mind introducing yourself quickly.
Just she, they, please.
And Seb, they, them, please.
Okay, we're now going to roll through the House, beginning with the opening government. If you wouldn't mind giving us your speaker positions and your pronouns if you'd like to specify them, beginning with the opening government. OG, if you wouldn't mind giving us your speaker positions and your pronouns if you'd like them.
Hello.
Yeah, sorry, you were unmuted, but we couldn't hear you. But we can hear you now. Could you give us those positions, please? Okay, I think there might be some connectivity issues for the speaker in opening government. This is the second speaker for opening government here.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Could you just confirm with your partner that they just need to try to sort that out? And could you give us the speaker?
Yeah. Sorry. Zarina speaking first, Rachel speaking second. No preference regarding pronouns.
Cheers, thank you. Opening opposition.
Taha going first, he, their pronouns preferred.
Taha Masud going second, he, their pronouns preferred.
Closing government.
Rachel speaking first, she or they is fine.
Naomi speaking second, she or they, thanks.
All right, and finally the closing opposition.
Hi everyone, for closing opposition, speaking first will be Chris prefers they, them. Speaking second will be Ivan prefers he, his, thanks.
Phenomenal. Just a few housekeeping rules. Speakers, I would really appreciate if before you begin your speech, you could specify how you'd like to receive POIs, either in the chat space or audibly. If a speaker doesn't specify, let's take it on faith that they want them in the chat space, so we don't have people being interrupted unnecessarily. I'll submit timing reminders 1, 6, and 7, although I do encourage you to keep a timer on your own. We will now, or rather, I would like to now call the House to order for the quarterfinal of the LSE Open 2020. And I'd like to welcome the opening government team and the Prime Minister Speaker. Here.
Hi, can I check I'm audible?
Yes, you're back and you're clearly audible.
Okay, I'm gonna keep my camera off because of the Wi-Fi, but I have the chat up, but I can't see anything else. So there's no point in giving me a verbal or physical POI, just put it in the chat. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. We're gonna bring you a plethora of points from opening government. The first is on how we believe people are able to get deeper spiritual meaning and connection to any higher entity which may or may not exist on our side of the house. The second point is on how we believe that organized religion uniquely brings harms in terms of political and economic control of our systems. The final point will be on sectarianism and splits within religion. And then if I have time, I'm going to talk about suffering in the human experience and how spiritualized religion and less organized religion is better able to help mitigate the suffering that humans experience. Before that, I want to be very clear on what we think the alternative world looks like. I think that there's probably a spectrum, and for different people, the lack of organized religion is likely to manifest itself in different ways. But given that the vast majority of people in the world follow organized religions, I think that those people at the very least will split up into 2 camps. For many people, this will be an individualized kind of sense of spirituality. They'll still have spirituality. Some cultures will still have it within them. And there'll be emphasis on finding your own personal methods in order to access spirituality. So your own personal journeys with whatever deity, or your own personal things that you do to get Zen, maybe new yoga or whatever. For many people though, we accept this is probably going to fall along like religious and cultural lines, but we think, as I'm going to prove later, that that's actually a good thing. So firstly, why do we get better experience? The first thing to note is that we think organized religion is uniquely coercive. And the reason that this matters is because the fact that it is coercive means that people are not accessing their higher fulfillment of like spiritual awakening because of the fear or hesitation to leave organized religion. There are a number of ways in which religion is likely to be coercive, or organized religion specifically. The first is that whilst everybody wants to believe that they are right, organized religion has a unique capacity to push out a homogenous doctrine via things like the patronage networks within organized religion. So for example, your ability to lose status and senior positions within organized religion should you speak out against a central doctrine, the fact that there are clear delineated boundaries between what is and doesn't constitute a member of that organized religion. So for example, you have to believe very specific things in order to be considered a Christian, and the loss of institutional privilege or risk of excommunication that people fear. So things like losing jobs, status, or access to schools within the Catholic Church. Things like the fear of going to hell because you're going to be excommunicated because you don't believe in certain aspects or core tenets of ideology are real fears that people who are on the more religious end of the spectrum fear, and these things stop them from even questioning how they might access a higher spiritual awakening. The reason that this matters is because I think that everyone deep down knows what they need to do to access their spiritual awakening, or knows what they would like to experiment and try. So things like when you're stressed out, the little tics that you have, who you talk to when you're in trouble. There are people who are atheists who end up like, talking to God or meditating when they're stressed out. But I think for a large subset of people, they're told that certain things are heathenish and that they can't do things because of the fact that it doesn't align with their religion. I think that on our side of the house, we've just removed that barrier, and therefore we get people feeling a greater sense of spiritual fulfillment. Clarification from CEO.
Yeah, look, this is an analysis motion. You have to give reasons why the counterfactual is what you say it is.
Like, I think I accepted that there is a plausible characterization that this falls under ethnic and cultural lines, because that's how people were grouped from the beginning of time. And the individualized motion and the individual element comes from the fact that people default to themselves unless there is an overriding social entity. I just think it's intuitive. And if you'd like to counter that, you have to give reasons why that's not true. Secondly, though, I think the fact that there is no organized religion on our side of the house means that there is a lesser imperative to spread your specific interpretation of religion. I think that this has a very specific benefit on our side of the house when the spread, we don't have seen the mass spread of things like Christianity and Islam throughout many of the most ethnically and culturally diverse places in the world, like parts of Africa and Asia, which have their own cultural norms and traditions. Now, I accept that to some extent, these things operate in unison on opposition side of the house to some extent, but I just think that many people abandon in pursuit of organized religion and the benefits tied towards it, like political power or colonialization mitigation, these organized religions. In the absence of them, we would have had a greater selection of cultural options diffused into society. Unless somebody wants to argue that enlightenment would have never happened, I'm going to assume things like the internet would have existed on both sides of the house, and therefore we would have had a greater preservation of these local cultural traditions, and therefore more choice to the average person if they need some level of direction. I want to note this is also how we win the clash of direction, because I'm assuming O is going to be like, yeah, but what are you going to do when you're lost and you don't have organized religion to tell you what to do? The fact that we have more options means that you have a greater capacity to make those choices for yourself. The final thing on better religion or better spirituality is just welfare and safeguarding. Because I think that, and yes, this is a small subset of cases, but a very impactful group, religion has a unique capacity, and the people within organized religion have a unique capacity to harm others within those religions through things like abuse, because they are in such a deferent position. The reason that this is unique is because these are your access to spiritual guidance, and especially from the kind of frame of reference of a young person, being told that you could go to hell if you don't listen to your priest when they tell you to do something, for example, is going to massively tip the extent to which you're willing to do those things. And obviously this occurs on a scale. Not everything is outright and trigger warning here, guys, like sexual abuse, but I do think that there are very problematic behaviors which are going to kind of like gaslighting, like blackmail, things that are likely to put people off the experience of organized religion, because these are the same people who are considered to be your route and your conduit to accessing that spirituality. So if they have harmed you and you realize that that has been the case, then you're likely to be put off it. On the comparative, when you have an individualized sense of religion, the only person who you can judge as the arbiter for your own access to happiness is yourself, and because you have a bias towards loving yourself, you're not going to fall out of love and religion because of the harm upon you of others. Finally, I want to talk about political and economic control. I think that organized religion has a unique capacity to be able to dominate our political and economic spheres, and this is for a number of reasons. The first is that many organized religions actively emphasize things like the pooling of money through their followers. So for example, the Catholic Church has a big emphasis on charity and being content, and the poor being content. And the reason that they do this is because they want people to give money to the charity, and because they don't want you to question the fact that in almost every jurisdiction where the Catholic or Anglican Church operates, they are the biggest landowner. Secondly, though, the hierarchical nature of these organizations, the fact they have managers, the fact that like in a mega church in like the US, right, they literally have like managing directors, means that these people are professionals who are able to use that money to lobby governments and are able to organize. Finally, the different relationship I was talking about of these people at the top of organized religions, like priests or pastors, means that their political opinion can be used like soaked in this veil of like, this is what God wants. And this is how often Republicans are able to get nominations in America. All of these things mean that you have a massive block of mobilized people who push for the imposition of their religion over other people. This also limits people's capacity to be able to access religion and the spirituality that they want, but more importantly means that this entity, which is just a capitalist entity in it for itself, is able to dominate discourse. For all of these reasons, I think we would prefer a world where people had choice themselves and where society were freer. We propose.
I'd also like to thank the Prime Minister Speaker for that fine speech. I would now like to call upon the opening opposition speaker and the leader of opening opposition team and the leader of opposition speaker. Here.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah. On three things in this speech. One, I'm going to talk about charity, why that's probably the most important thing. I'm going to talk about social change, and then I'm going to do a bit about meaning, which we don't really care about that much, but fine. But before that, I want to do some things in terms of setup. So if opening government believes that without religion, we wouldn't have things like wars or violence or, governments being taken over, I would say that there's lots of in-group, out-group ideologies that we already believe in. Nationalism gave us World War II. Religion had very little to do with it. There's racism, and I would presume that racism would be much worse in a world where religion wasn't there and you couldn't attack slavery or the institution of slavery using religion. And the third thing I would point out is resources are still limited on this planet, historically have been. People would still fight and people would still find reasons to commit that sort of violence. So this debate is not about violence. It will probably exist on both sides. In terms of accountability, I'm going to talk about a few things because I think that's probably the most important part of their case in terms of, the priest says, I am the conduit of God and therefore you must always follow me. There's 4 reasons why I think in the modern world, we have loads of accountability for this. The first thing is media institutions exist all over the world and they've been uncovering this. And if they want to get their revenues up, they need to produce something that's newsworthy. Attacking probably the most well-known institution in the world and saying that they are like basically like a circle of sexual abuse and so on would probably get you viewers. So I think that there's lots of scrutiny there. The second thing I would point out is that there's lots of secular governments out there who are willing to prosecute you. The third thing I would note is that religions are in competition with each other for followers, but this also translates into intra-faith competition in the sense that religions have multiple sects within them, which are also competing, which is why you are now likelier to be on your best behavior, and which is why the Pope even now is much more left-wing, pro-climate change policy and all of that sort of thing, pro-refugees than they were in the past. That said, 3 things on our side. 1, charity. Now, in terms of mechanisms, why do we crucially only get charity on our side, and why does their case not make sense? The first thing is, in terms of mechanisms, there are religious texts which oftentimes have scripts like "help thy neighbor," etc., which encourage you to help people in need. The second thing would be that there are formal requirements for alms giving, like zakat, for instance, in Islam. The third thing would be religions oftentimes have their own charitable organizations giving this, especially in crucially vulnerable areas. What is the structural reason for why religion is probably the only source, organized religion is probably the only source of charity or the major source of charity in the world? For that, we need to ask where the origin of religion came from, especially in terms of Abrahamic faiths, which are probably the biggest organized religions in the world. They oftentimes came from one dude saying, I believe in God, this is bullshit. But oftentimes that one dude had to probably go to the most exploited people in that system to appease them and get them on their side. And these used to be the poorest of the poor within those systems, if you're talking about the Middle East. Now, in terms of that, I think that's carried forward in terms of how religions have developed. But there's 3 other mechanisms that I've also previously noted. All religions are competing for followers. So they're doing 2 things. One, you either need to win new followers, first, because religions are dying out because of secularization in the world, or two, you also do not want to lose existing followers in the world who oftentimes grow up and aren't religious at all. This is not just because of your religious duty in terms of spreading the word of God, which is obviously something that all religious people want to do, but secondly, also in terms of the resources that they can get for propagation of their own religion. It's dependent on them actually having followers, so they need a nice PR campaign. And this also similarly applies to competition, not only with other religions, but they're also competing within the same religion. So things like Shias versus Sunnis, for instance, or Protestants versus Catholics. There's loads of different sects within every single religion, and they're competing with each other for those resources, for those followers. But the third thing I would say is that the reason you want charity specifically is you're not only competing with religious groups, you're also competing with secular and atheist critics who keep on attacking religion and saying that it is a force for evil. All of these are incentives for why religions want a good PR thing, which is why they're accountable, but also why they're not only doing charity, but they're also likely, and this is important, to increase charity work in the future. Why is this going to be increased? Because now we have science, now we have secularization, we have capitalism, people don't have time to go to church, all of that sort of thing has meant that religion generally, especially within the developed world, is on the downturn, which is why they obviously need to do this to make people believe that this is something worth believing in. What is the weighing for charity in this round? Why is this the most important thing? I would note that in the vast majority of the developing world, taxation nets are pretty poor. Lots of people aren't taxed, and even when they are taxed, there's loads of corruption, and governments aren't the most efficient mechanisms through which you can give social welfare. Religions are crucially, or religious churches or mosques, etc., are crucially the only institutions that can provide this social welfare to these people. So things like education, food, and healthcare crucially are only provided by these institutions. Before moving on, I'll take closing down.
Surely the likely scenario is that other communities arise based on other common interests and things that people want to do for each other. Why is religion unique in bringing people together?
Yeah, because you have a unique infrastructure, which is a church, which is also a synagogue, which is a mosque. All of your like hippie, spiritualist, new age religion stuff, that bullshit won't have those sorts of infrastructures. And if they do, then boo-hoo, they're organized. All right, cool. The next big thing, what's the weighing then of this education, food, and healthcare? One, I would say that even if you're exploited, as OG says, and you have limited choices within the framework of religion, to make those choices, you need basic things. So for instance, food on the table, shelter, also things like education, which enable you to make choices in the future. So I'd probably prioritize these over limited choices for poor people who are going to get fucked in their world anyways. For the second thing in terms of social change that I want to focus on, I would point out that leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. or Archbishop Desmond Tutu or lots of people who were anti-slavery during the early days of slavery, they found this through religion. Similar things. Religion also didn't only come up as a challenge to like moral codes, it came up as a challenge to tyranny. There are lots of verses within the Quran, within the Bible, which also talk about oppression. These religions are also crucially kind of left-wing in terms of where they came from, because they're also the biggest following that they have is within poor people, but two, historically it's been that way, so they're more likely left-wing and anti-tyranny. And the third thing is religions oftentimes within the developing world were opposed to the westernized or colonized elites that came in. So people like I don't know, Pakistani landlords, etc., who got money off of British colonialists, they're against those kinds of people. Why is this then crucial in terms of social change? I would note that there are immense costs of protesting or going out against an extremely tyrannical government, even if you include people like Gaddafi, for instance. These costs are losing your life or losing lots of money as an opportunity cost. I would note that there are three mechanisms through which religion allows us to do this. One, you believe God is on your side, so you believe you're going to be successful. Otherwise, you would just been this goes down to chance. The second thing is it's framed as a religious duty, and the third thing is there are promised benefits in the hereafter, even if you do not succeed. Which is why people are much more likely to protest, and which is why people are likely to bring dictatorships and tyrannical governments. For all these reasons, very proud to oppose.
I'd also like to thank the Leader of Opposition Speaker for that fine speech, and now welcomes the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case of the opening government. Hear, hear.
Hiya. Am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
Great. All right, I'll just get a timer up. All right. Starting my speech in 3. Oh, also, I would prefer POIs in chat if that's okay with people. Sorry. Starting my speech in 3, 2, one. The problem with what we hear from the last speaker is that what the distinction that he fails to make is between organized religion, which is a series of institutions that across the world is probably one of the largest, if not the largest landowner ever to exist across any human civilization, and the fact of believing that you have the support of God and that God directs you to care about others in society. It wasn't good enough for them to stand up and tell us that religion has some benefits to individuals, because the comparative that Zarina mechanized for you and defended to you was never that religion collapsed altogether, but rather that religion occurred in a more organic, community-based way. Yes, sometimes along similar lines to how organized religion currently groups populations, but without the institutional, coercive economic underpinnings of that. Or it occurs in a more it occurs additionally in a more individuated way, where people consider their relationship with faith more personally. Because we never got engagement with that comparative, either to undo Zarina's mechanization or to explain why it's necessarily the case that in order for people to have religious faith that quote unquote supports their desire to protest, it's the case that they need organized religion, they can't take the debate. I'm going to do basically three things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to look at the very limited engagement we get with Zarina's case. Then I'm going to look at what religion looks like on either side of the house, then what social organization looks like on either side of the house. And finally, I'm going to bring you some new analysis on sectarianism and political structures created by organized religion. Firstly, on the response to Zarina. Note and trigger warning here for sexual abuse. Zarina explains to you why it's the case that the way in which churches and large-scale religion operates necessarily means that they have an incentive and the ability to shield members who commit acts of abuse or acts of sexual violence in order to preserve the perceived sanctity of them as conduits to God. What responses do we get from the last speaker? Firstly, he tells us that the media has an incentive to cover sexual abuse. Note how utterly this ignores the analysis that Zarina gives you about the level of control and entrenchment that organized religion has in many countries where it exists. If you're in an area where like a Mormon megachurch is operative, the local newspaper is owned by that church. Everybody who writes for it practices that faith and goes to that church every week. We think that actually the kinds of exposés that they talk about are incredibly uncommon in conservative, religiously entrenched societies and are likely to be unpopular with those populations. Then in response to all of the analysis she gives you on coercion, he says religions are in competition with each other. Note that this competition is precisely what organized religion works against and actively stops. Why? Because in order to move between religions or change your religious position, you have to accept the fact that you leave behind everybody in your community who's tied into that faith institutionally. You have to accept the fact that you lose tenancy on the laundrette that you own that is placed on land which is owned by a megachurch. Your economic well-being is contingent on you remaining part of that religion. And note that even if you don't buy that mechanism, the very thing that he brings you, panel, the fact that religions are in competition with one another, if that is true, then it's an additional reason why they have an incentive when organized to suppress abuse within their own ranks in order to avoid defection. Let's talk about then how religion happens, because we basically get one response to this and it only comes from closing opposition, nothing from OO on this issue. In one POI, they say to Zarina, you don't give reasons why people react to the absence of organized religion in the way that you describe. Look, note that a lot of the features that we abhor in organized religion, like the fact that they have the power to lobby governments because they're large and rich, like the fact that they have the ability to control the tenancies and the businesses of their members, are things that rely on the fact of a religion existing on like an institutional scale and with like institutional hierarchical features, and therefore are things that like unnecessarily removed in a world without that thing. But also note how unresponsive this is to Zarina's mechanization, because she explains to you why it's the case that people in the majority of instances who currently practice under organized religion would, in a world without it, continue to want a relationship with God, but also why those people are likely to want a relationship with God that reflects their own need. Look at the current norm of LGBTQ Christians moving outside the evangelical or the Catholic or the Presbyterian church in order to adopt a more personal relationship with God. We think that's a model for what things are likely to look like on our side of the house. Also, though, note that Zarina did concede that there was an extent to which this would happen along community lines. And it seems from their POI that CO wants to imply that this is problematic. A couple of things here. If CO have an issue with community organization or like geographical proximity or ethnicity or any of the other factors that might feed into the ways in which religious belief or religious practice would coalesce in our new world, note that this is going to be to a considerably lesser extent to organized religion, where this is actually enforced by things like the political and economic structures in your society. charity. So if their opposition is to community religion, it's an odd stance for them to take from Theo on this motion. Let's talk then about how social organization happens on either side of the house, because this is where we do actually get some material from opening opposition. Firstly, they tell us that there are lots of in-group and out-group ideologies like nationalism, and therefore we shouldn't care about religion. Note that we may well concede that nationalism is bad, and on another debate we might possibly have opposed it, but the fact that nationalism is a bad thing isn't a reason to believe that if organized religion is a bad thing, we shouldn't also oppose it. They tell us racism is likely to get worse in a world where we don't have organized religion. They provide no mechanization for this assertion, beyond presumably implying that racial prejudice is some kind of closed system in which if it like seeps out of organized religion, it will come out through another form. I'm going to tell you in my material why it's the case that organized religion in and of itself actively compounds racist sentiment by encouraging an us versus them mentality within faiths and between faiths. Then they say religion facilitates charity. I'm going to point out here that this is an area where they're not considering enough what the role of organized religion in this debate is, because the desire to donate to charity is often an article of doctrine that is completely unrelated to organized religion. It's a part of religious belief that is like tied into the fabric of scripture and worship outside of the organizational form of that. So many people of faith, on the comparative, are much more likely to give to secular charities, which don't do many of the abusive things that organized religion do, like drawing money out of that charitable fund to like support their own things, or only giving to beneficiaries who they share a religious faith with. We think that actually what this really looks like in the real world is that religious charities draw a huge amount of funding that would otherwise have gone to secular charities away, because they're able to coerce their members into giving them there. When they tell us that people need to receive food to make choice, we think it's utterly abhorrent when many of the religious charities that they supposedly support will only feed you if you subscribe to their particular narrow iteration of Christianity or Islam. Then they say lots of religions are very left-wing. Note that a lot of left-wing figures within religions, even somebody like Pope Francis, who by the way is barely marginal in terms of his left-wing views, or is like barely out there in terms of his left-wing views, is actually a relatively marginal and unpopular figure within the church. When they talk about religions opposing colonialization, note that colonialization was a process that was brought about by organized religion against more community-based, individually practiced worship that already existed in those communities. Look, when religion has structural economic incentives to entrench capitalist power because it owns the land and the means of production that is generating that capitalist power, we think that religious people who are left-wing because of scripture are much more likely to exist on our side of the house without the worst incentives of organized religion. For all these reasons, incredibly proud to propose.
I'd also like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister Speaker for that fine speech. Just a reminder to speakers as well, POIs are really important in terms of debating, so do your best to take some and give some. With that in mind, I'd like to welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close out the opening half of today's debate. Here.
Am I audible?
You are.
Just 1 second to set up my timer. Okay, I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. It's become abundantly clear that the opening government doesn't know what organized religion is, because their conception of it pretty much seems to just be the Catholic Church, and nothing else. You'll notice that all of their argumentation regarding religion being the largest landowner in the world is hung on this. You'll notice that strange arguments like regarding articles of faith are hung on this. I'll be getting into those later in my debate. But the basic point we need to make here is religion is a lot more expansive. Organized religion is a lot more expansive than what they've been talking about, and can in fact produce the type of social change and charity we want to discuss. Let's start by talking about that, charity and social change specifically. We had a couple of responses from opening government over here. Firstly, that you can in fact still have charity inside their sort of more individualized religion model, because charity is fundamentally an article of faith and has nothing to do with organization. This is nonsense, because charity is often very much an institutional part of organized religion. It is part of, for instance, zakat in Islam, where it is part of a government's duty to dispense charity throughout the entire population. Or it's institutional in the sense that churches, even though they may have religious obligation, will carry out charity drives. So the idea that this is just an article of faith that will be carried out no matter what form of religion you subscribe to is untrue. But secondly, then they try to argue, well, actually this religious charity draws funding away from other charities. My response firstly is no. Many people are giving exclusively because of their love of community, their love of their church, their love of their mosque in particular. That's why this charity exists in the first place. It isn't symmetric. It wouldn't exist in any other case, especially if you all exist as a bunch of atomized religious individuals who cannot relate to one another or each other's spirituality. Secondly, I say people have a natural disincentive to give charity absent this, because in capitalism, giving away money comes at cost to yourself. Therefore, you need an active incentive to give charity to prove that charity exists. They haven't proven one. Therefore, any impacts which come from charity come from our side. But furthermore, there's reasons to believe that organized religion, quite apart from this, further incentivizes charity. This comes back to the competition point we're talking about, where different religions, and even within religions, different groups are within competition with each other. The fundamental thing we need to realize here is that religions and religious groups justify themselves on a moral basis. They consider themselves moral actors. This is how they sell themselves and understand themselves. Therefore, to outcompete other religious groups, you need to prove that you are the more moral actor. One of the easiest ways of doing this is precisely by giving charity, and this becomes a race to the top, in fact. Whereas one church gives charity, other churches, to prove their superiority, need to give comparable or greater amounts of charity just to prove that they're in the same moral playing field, to prove that they are, in fact, good, religious, and decent people on the whole. This also ties back to the idea about social change, which we think has gone almost entirely unrefuted at government, because all they basically had to say here was religion isn't that left-wing. Yeah, religion may not be that left-wing, but it's kind of left-wing, which is a lot better than having nothing or a completely neutral thing as is going to be happening in their model. What are some of the ways that we know that religion is likely to promote social change? Firstly, it is in fact likely to be anti-racist, because religion tells you you're all equal, you're all God's children. All the major organized religions in the world tell you this. So simply put, its belief system is hinged against inequality, is hinged against privilege. Secondly, we tell you that religion carries out the sorts of things that are necessary to provide for the poor, specifically when governments are failing. This is empirically proven as well. When throughout like the inflationary crisis that were racking the Middle East 20 years ago, it was Islamic political groups which gave to the poor and made little welfare systems for them when governments were unable to. Ditto for Christian groups in Latin America whenever there's cases of instability. So we know that governments, when they're failing, are unable to shore up these vulnerable groups, but religious groups are able to do so. The crucial impact of this then becomes that these groups become religious and are also willing to do something about the injustices being wrought against them. And now are given the capacity to do so, because religion doesn't just provide you with meaning, although it does, it also provides you with organization, with institutions, places to meet, a regular meeting time, all sorts of things around which you can coalesce, organize, and do something, meaning that you're likelier to be able to produce change against oppressive and tyrannical governments in a world where organized religion exists than not. And the reason that this is not symmetric again is specifically because organization is the critical factor here. It is the capacity to have an institution, the capacity to have hierarchy and authority, and the ability to dispense orders. Religion allows you to form an almost vanguard-like party, which lets you produce change far more effectively than anything else ever could. Before I go on, I'll take closing if they have one. Sorry, opening.
Surely, in order to avoid defection and with the belief that God is on your side, as you describe, organized religious structures have an incentive to demonize alternative faiths and other sects within their faith and to encourage their followers to act violently.
Defection is a big deal in religion. Defection is rare and often unlikely. Therefore, you don't need to demonize the enemy, because all you have to do is essentially valorize yourself. Say, we are the best. There is obviously some degree of then they are less good than us that comes with this, but we don't think it's necessary that it goes to the extreme of active demonization. But furthermore, if you harken back to what I was saying about religions needing to justify themselves as moral agents, I think it becomes pretty intuitive to assume that they're likely to try to sell a good message to their followers than their bad ones, just because it's easier for them to internally digest that this is a moral faith that we're following. The final thing I want to talk about goes back to the idea of deeper spiritual meaning. And I'm going to be engaging with HUJI here. They had a few things to say. Number one, they said most people know how to access deeper spiritual meaning. My first response, yeah, that's true in both cases. If you have that deeper ability to access social meaning, you can do that in a world with organized religion as well. You can work within the boundaries of organized religion, still access that deeper meaning. Second response, I mean, we can amplify that deeper ability to access your own social meaning with institutional memory, which is what organized religion provides you. Sure, let's assume people have some intuition for how to access religion themselves. Wouldn't it be even better if we had 1,000 years of history and philosophical writing from an organized religion telling you exactly how people have been developing this deeper meaning for thousands of years? I think that's pretty obvious. Secondly, they said, well, you're less likely to stamp out more specific local versions of religion if you don't have organized religion. My response, firstly, I'm not sure what the value of having 1,000 little religions is, frankly. Like, maybe you get a very minor amplification of deeper spiritual meaning, but it doesn't seem clear to me that that's very obvious. But also, I think that to the largest degree, organized religion does not wipe out or erase local religion. It melds with it and syncretizes and produces a bunch of fusionary religions, which all operate within the larger organized religion umbrella. So you don't really lose that much anyway. Further, the biggest harm we get over here from them is about accountability, where they basically say it's possible to suffer abuse and all sorts of abuses of power under organized religion. A few responses here. First of all, organizations actually provide accountability mechanisms. So the fact of it being organized religion means that it can actually have internal accountability mechanisms, which wouldn't be able to exist without that. In the absence of an organized religion, if you're in whatever, let's say, cultural or whatever-esque group you have in this hazy open government world, you're much more likely to be victim to charismatic authority, which is much harder to hold accountable, because whatever a random person you've chosen as like a guru or some sort of spiritual mentor there has no actual institutional checks and balances upon them. But furthermore, we also tell you that the media has an incentive to aggressively hold organized religion accountable, precisely because it is such a big deal as they themselves have identified in the real world, and therefore it drives up sensationalist ratings to actually keep it accountable. Ultimately, we take this debate because organized religion, by virtue of organization, uniquely promotes charity and social change for the most depressed classes in this world, and because it's actually better for promoting social meaning, spiritual meaning. On all those grounds, very proud to oppose.
Thank you so much to the speaker from the opening opposition team for that fine speech. We're now going to welcome the closing government team and the member of government speaker. Here.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Cool. I'm just organizing my papers. Sorry, they are slightly messy. Hopefully that is fine. Cool. I'm going to start. Before I start POIs in the chat, I'll take one at some point after the 5-minute mark. Would love to take one from CO as I have no idea what they're running and love to be able to engage properly. That being said, 3, 2, 1. One piece of extraneous rebuttal regarding charity. Then I'm going to talk about manipulation and why it is easy. It is better, and the world we are getting on our side is one where you can have the ability to choose what is best for you, whether it's entering or exiting a religion, and you are able to do that on our side, whereas you are not able to do that in a world with organized religions. And I'm going to explain to you why that is significant. Cool. But regarding charity, because I think in the status quo, we just look at it and we see that opening opposition is just factually incorrect, because the largest charity funds in the status quo are secular ones. They are philanthropic funds that are more effective because they allocate their charity in a way that tries to maximize the good that they are doing, and also just more just because they don't discriminate based on who receives the charity and who receives the benefits based off of, do they follow this one specific religion or not? We think a world that has more of these and less of the comparative is a better world, where more people are receiving charity and getting their needs taken care of in that way. But also this just proves that people do have moral compasses without religion. We see these things that people have ethics with, like Confucianism and like non-centralized religion. Cool. Firstly, and so constructive, because note what the incentive structure of religious organizations are. I'm going to take religious organizations at their best and not assume that they are terrible or corrupt, etc. Because note that it is in your incentive to gatekeep what religion is and tell your followers that there is only one correct way to live and one correct way to worship, right? This is true because you have the incentive to keep followers, because you think that what you are doing is genuinely the only way to worship God the best way. And if your followers don't continue following you, they are going to burn in hell. They're going to condemn their souls to eternal damnation. And you don't want this to happen. If you are corrupt, or if you have external motivations, you also potentially want to consolidate power, and you're able to do this by maximizing your followers and maximizing their dedication to religion. But either way, what this means is that you have your followers believe that there is only one correct way to live, one correct way of existing, and that people who don't follow this are damned. They are heretics, right? They are evil because they have rejected the word of God. They want to live in damnation, or that they are potentially occasionally working for adverse opposing goals, and this is something that is actively hurting. So what they are doing is something that is actively trying to send us to hell, or actively trying to hurt our way of life, right? What this means is that you have the incentive to portray non-religious or other religions as unappealing as possible, right? And this is also just in engagement with opening opposition, why people from one religion just tend not to help people from other religions or people who aren't religious at all. Also, what does this mean? One, people cannot leave religions, and this is engaging with OO, who accepts this. What this is for, because A, you are personally brainwashed to believe that if you don't fit into this, then something is wrong with you, because this is the one way to live, and why am I not living properly? Why am I wrong? Why is something incorrect with me if I struggle to deal with the religion? Because if the religion is true and this is how God created us, then the problem is not with God. It is not with anyone in that community. It is something that I have as a problem myself, and it is wrong with me. What it means is that I'm likely to suppress this and try to continue living in the one way that I know is acceptable, but constantly being unhappy, being miserable, hating yourself. And we think that is a miserable existence. And we think that we would rather people have the option to leave religion at the point they're stuck into this and they aren't able to in the status quo. Secondly, they don't think of this as an option, right? If this is the one way to live, and if you leave this, you are evil, or you're condemned to damnation, that it is not an option for you. It is not a conceivable notion of leaving the religion in the first place. Thirdly, even if you decide to do this, what happens is that you have ties cut off with everyone you have grown up with, your entire community. Your family is no longer as willing to talk to you because what you were doing is actively rejecting God and rejecting their way of life and becoming a heretic and spitting in their faces. Your family is, even beyond that, your family is likely to be shamed as being related to you. And so not only are you potentially hurting yourself and your ties with your family, but you're actively hurting the family that you leave behind. Next, we think that also just people, what this means is that people are stuck in that religion as long as they are born in that religion. Secondly, I think it is just hard to join or rejoin religions in the first place because outsiders are villainized, as I've explained to you. So it is less likely, even if you have accepted God, for you to be accepted within that religion because you are seen as having lived a life of sin and having not come to the religion earlier despite doing that. Secondly, you are considered an outsider or a heretic, so you have more scrutiny by that community and you're less able to question or less able to do things because people are constantly expecting you to break the mold or be incorrect or be wrong because you are strange than curiosity. Thirdly, you just have barriers of antagonism built up by the rhetoric that is surrounding how we perceive outsiders. And so you are less likely to be able to reap any type of benefits or less likely to be able to practice. And I'll quickly take closing opposition, please, please, please.
Okay, yeah, I mean, how likely is it that people do want to leave religions on your side?
So I think it is quite likely that people would want to leave religions if they knew it was the option, or that religions feel suffocating for many people. They just do not see an alternative. I think many people in the status quo, as we see, find issues with different types of religion, but know that if they leave, it is going to be hard for them to return or maintain any type of relationship or ties with the former family. We see this historically. We know this is a fact. This is how spin-offs have existed, and we think it is rough that they had to go through what they have to, right? Cool. What is the comparative, right? Because we think that people are likely to be able to practice differently. Because even within your family, you have parents observing and connecting in different ways. You have people within your community that are, even if it is broadly similar, that are doing things slightly differently and accepting things slightly differently. You also have people marrying it to the community and coming in externally who have entirely different views on religion, entirely different ways they have of connecting with God, which makes it harder for you to put barriers between types of religion and makes it much harder to advocate for one religion being the only one that is correct when we have people and family members that are practicing an entirely different one. What this likely means is that people are more able to leave or enter one without the judgment and ostracization that comes the status quo, which allows people to find the one that is best for them and the most meaning in their life, allows people to live a life where they don't feel trapped, and allows for more cooperation, less polarization broadly in society. For all these reasons, please propose this motion.